All right, hello everyone, good evening. Before I launch into a quick introduction, let me just say a word of technical support for anybody who would benefit from it. We have closed captioning available if you click down at the bottom of your screen. The chat for this call is disabled to audience members. However, the Q&A function that you'll also find in the menu at the bottom can be used for posing any questions. We'll be checking that throughout the lecture, and I'll give some more instructions about the format of Q&A once we get later into the talk. Good evening. My name is David Shayevitz, and I'm a professor of Jewish history here at Northwestern and director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you tonight to the latest installment of the Philip and Ethel Klutznick Lecture in Jewish Civilization, which we're co-hosting together with the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago. Before kicking things off, allow me to say just a word or two about the Crown Family Center and to acknowledge some of the people who've made tonight's event possible. The Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies is an academic hub for undergraduate and graduate education, innovative faculty and student research, and accessible and engaging public programming. Our students, affiliated faculty members, visiting professors, and postdoctoral fellows study, teach, and research Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Hebrew and Yiddish language and literature, Holocaust studies, and the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. The Crown Family Center is comprised of over a dozen affiliated full-time faculty members, a robust group of visiting scholars and postdoctoral fellows, an undergraduate major, 2 undergraduate minors, an interdisciplinary graduate cluster, and dozens of annual courses that enroll hundreds of students. Part of what makes the Crown Center unique among the university's many departments, programs, and centers is our dedication to communal engagement and to building bridges between the university and the wider public. And tonight's event is one of several recent and upcoming programs that aims to strengthen exactly this connection. We've just put into the chat the web address for the Crown Center website. There you can find ways to follow us on Facebook, sign up for our mailing list, and also browse upcoming events and some recordings of past events as well. Now, perhaps the best example of our community-facing mission is our longstanding partnership with the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago, with whom we're co-hosting tonight's event. Our partnership with the Federation includes an annual postdoctoral fellowship in Israel Studies, funded by the Jewish Federation, which brings young scholars from Israel to Evanston to study and teach about modern Israel. We also work closely on campus with Northwestern's Hillel, which is an affiliate of the Federation and helps us to connect students' classroom experiences with their campus communal lives. And for the last 35 years, the Federation and Northwestern have partnered to host a public lecture, which would highlight the very best of academic Jewish studies scholarship in ways that are accessible and engaging, and which speak not only to the long history of Jewish civilization, but also to its impact upon the present and the future of the Jewish world. In all these 35 years, I regret to say we've only missed one Klutznick lecture, and that was last year in spring 2020, when it goes without saying the pandemic forced us to cancel our in-person programming. However, I'm delighted that our return to form this year features Professor Ken Sieskin, who for many years served as the Klutznick Chair of Jewish Civilization at Northwestern. Now, Dean Adrian Randolph will give Ken a more proper introduction in just a moment, but I want to take this opportunity just personally to say how honored we are to be able to learn from him tonight. Now, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Pam Sokol, who's the board chair of the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago, and who will offer some welcoming remarks. Pam, take it away.
Thank you so much, Professor Shayevitz. So JUF is really honored to partner with Northwestern University on this annual lecture. This is just one example of JUF's close collaboration with this esteemed university. For over a decade, the Israel Studies Project has brought Israeli and postdoctoral fellows to educate NU students on the history of the Middle East and Israeli culture. They also serve as resources to the larger community in their fields of expertise. This program is a joint effort between the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israeli Studies and JUF. However, perhaps the most important aspect of our partnership is the university's support of its Jewish students and the institutions that serve them. The university has strived to ensure that Jewish students are an integral part of the campus community. And an investment in the Crown Center has enabled the university to be a leading institution in Jewish and Israeli studies. As you may know, the Northwestern Hillel is considered amongst the best in the country, offering the highest quality programming in a variety of areas. And while the pandemic certainly upended the model, Hillel staff, under the leadership of Michael Simon, rose to the occasion. They continued to serve students wherever they were, on campus or back at their parents' homes. Hillel filled a critical need for students to connect with each other and feel a sense of belonging to a community while being isolated socially. I'm really proud of the work of our Hillel staff, who will be working out of a newly renovated building. The wear and tear on the building that necessitated the renovation is a true testament to the hub it had become for Jewish students on campus. Another prime example of the university's commitment to the Jewish students was a recent symposium on anti-Semitism, Zionism, and social justice. The collaboration among the Crown Center, Hillel, and JUF's Israel Education Center demonstrated a willingness to confront a difficult and important topic for today's students. Finally, I would like to extend JUF's appreciation to our keynote speaker tonight, Professor Kenneth Seeskin. Ken has been an important voice on campus and in our community on scholarship in Jewish philosophy and studies. We thank him for his contributions in this field and wish him the best in his retirement. I will now turn the program back to you, Professor Shayevitz.
Thank you so much, Pam, for those lovely words. And I will now have the honor of introducing Adrian Randolph, who's the Dean of the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, and who's been a wonderful proponent and supporter of Jewish studies on campus, and he will be introducing tonight's speaker. Dean Randolph.
Thanks, David, and thank you, Pam. I can't say how, just how proud we are to work with the JUF and with the Crown Center and with Hillel. Michael, I hope you're out there. It'd be good to get together sometime. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event. As you've heard, I'm Dean Adrian Randolph. I have the pleasure of serving as Dean of Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. And it truly is my great pleasure. And I know those words sound like just things one say as an introduction, but it is such a pleasure to participate in this year's Philip M. and Ethel Klutznick Lecture in Jewish Civilization. This event is truly a highlight of my calendar, and I can't wait till we're all back in person, but it's great that we can share this tonight via Zoom. This year's event, I have to say, is possibly even more special than all of the other ones, because this year the lecture will be offered by the extraordinary, inimitable, and beloved Ken Seeskin. After his 5 decades at Northwestern, and let that just sink in, 5 decades at Northwestern, it's hard to know where the university ends and Ken begins, so intertwined are the two. Ken came to Northwestern in 1964 as an undergraduate. And it's true, he spent some years off in the wilderness at Yale as a graduate student, but soon he was back home, returning to Northwestern as an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy in 1972. Rising through the ranks, Ken became indispensable to the department and to the college, serving for what may be seen as an unprecedented 16-year term as chair of philosophy, which for those of you outside the academy is almost an unimaginable commitment nowadays that someone would spend that long as chair of an academic department. But as chair, he developed a truly eclectic mode of hiring faculty, emphasizing excellence over subfields and producing a brilliant faculty roster that continues to shine today. And while he was chair of philosophy, Ken also served his first term as director of Jewish studies, a program that truly thrived under his leadership. And I think it's fair to say that Jewish studies today would not be where it is without Ken's truly extraordinary contributions. And to give you a sense of his breadth, in 2010, Ken stepped in as chair of religious studies, another department with which he has a great intellectual affinity. And I should also mention, by the way, along the way, he directed our Center for Writing Arts. The fact is, Ken has done so many things institutionally over his time here that he truly is an institutional multitasker, a ranging talent who has the ability to collaborate with colleagues from such a vast array of disciplines. And it is his pluralism and openness that perhaps is captured even in his very first published work, an article entitled, and I quote here, "Many Valued Logic and Future Contingencies," which I think could be taken as perhaps a tag for today's environment. This is what we need. We need many valued logic and future contingencies in the midst of this crisis we find ourselves. As a scholar, Ken is known as a major thinker in the study of Jewish philosophy. I associate Ken above all with the thinking of Moses ben Maimon, better known as Maimonides, the 12th century polymath, Saladin's doctor, rabbi, and philosopher. And it's unsurprising that Ken opted to spend so much of his academic career studying such a thinker, one in whose writings Ken could explore his own expansive ideas. In his best known work on Maimonides, at least to me, the 2005 Maimonides and On the Origin of the World, Ken explores thoughts on the creation, the very origins of the world. And this reflection on origins is bookended by his 2012 book on Jewish messianic thoughts in an age of despair, which sounds like a read that might not lead to joy and let's say excitement, but is actually really an interesting read. And if you have interest in this notion of messianic Jewish thinking, it really is a wonderful read. The repeated musings on the Messiah that dot Jewish thinking are sites for Ken not of disappointment, but rather consolation and redemption. And this reading of the tradition, like Ken himself, is truly pluralistic. It's humane, and it's twinkling with humor. And I can't claim to know Ken as well as others do, having only been at Northwestern for a fraction of his tenure at our institution. But he was one of the individuals who, early in my tenure as dean, helped me understand the college and the university, something for which I'm eternally grateful. I did also encounter Ken at football games. A stalwart at the stadium, Ken, somewhat an anomaly among faculty, I would say, is a wildcat in profound ways, in that he shows up in all aspects of the life on campus. Ken cares deeply about our university and about the college at its heart, and about Jewish studies and the expansive intellectual ground that he has spent his life really exploring. And as he engages with retirement as the Philip M. and Ethik Klutznick Professor Emeritus of Jewish Civilization, it's proper and fitting that he offers this year's iteration of the lecture that bears the names of those philanthropists who established the professorship that will forever be associated with his name. So Ken, take it away. Thank you for being who you are.
Adrian, thank you for a very, very lovely and really overly generous introduction. Normally, when I give a public lecture, I'm afraid of two things. One is that I'm going to leave my lecture notes at home. And the other is that I'm going to go before a big audience with my zipper open, both of which have happened, by the way. I don't think those will be a problem tonight. And so my great fear tonight is my internet connection. If you know a prayer for modems and for routers, things like that, this would be an excellent time to say it. Okay, the title of my lecture, Es ist schwer sein a Yid, It is Hard to Be a Jew, is a quote taken from Sholem Aleichem. And my guess is that right at the start, you're probably thinking, look, Professor Siskin, we don't need you to tell us that, we already know it. From the time that God first asked Abraham to leave the home of his father to anti-Semitism in our own day, Jewish existence has always been precarious. As Telia says to God in Fiddler on the Roof, look, couldn't somebody else be the chosen people once in a while? Well, this is the phenomenon that I want to explore. And let me say at the outset, not all the news is bad. So let's start with the good news. Consider Northwestern University. It's well known it did not always welcome Jews. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, it had a Jewish quota. The Ivies did too. They were no different. The quota was finally lifted in the 1960s when I entered as a freshman. And even then, in the 1960s, all the courses in Jewish studies were handled by one person, Professor Manfred Vogel. In that era, nobody would have dreamed that by the time I retired from Northwestern, there would be a thriving Jewish studies program, not to mention the Feinberg School of Medicine, the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, the Pritzker School of Law, the Bienen School of Music, and certainly nobody would have thought that the whole outfit would be run by a guy named Morty Shapiro. Again, let me say that Northwestern was not alone in its attitude to Jews. For a long time, the prevailing attitude in universities is that if you wanted to study Jewish history, religion, or culture, you belonged in a seminary, not a university. And this was buttressed by the argument used both in Europe and in the United States that Jews were not a part of Western culture. You heard that right. Jews are not a part of Western culture, and therefore Jews had no business teaching Western history, literature, or philosophy. So, for example, it made no sense to have a Jew teaching Plato, Shakespeare, the French Revolution, or Renaissance painting. Today, it's as if we're in a completely different universe. Leading universities across Europe and the North America have their own Jewish studies programs, lectureships, journals, book series, conferences, you name it. And you know what? The amazing thing in all of this is that there's only one generation that separates me from my grandparents who were born in the shtetl. So I believe that when the history of the Jewish people in our age is written, it will show that one of our great accomplishments was getting leading universities to recognize that Jewish history, religion, and culture are a legitimate part of the study of the arts and sciences. I'll put this as bluntly as I can. Having been freed from the ghetto in the 18th and 19th centuries, we finally got a seat at the academic table in the 20th. That's the good news, and I think it's pretty good. The bad news, when you get outside academia and you look at what is happening in Europe and North America, you will find that anti-Semitism is on the rise almost everywhere. As a kid growing up in Chicago, I remember being called a dirty Jew. I remember getting into fights on the playground. I remember communities in Chicago where Jews were not allowed to settle, country clubs, resorts where Jews were not welcome. But I have to tell you, I never remember going to a synagogue where there had to be armed guards standing outside lest the congregation expose itself to mass murder. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism seems to grow like a weed. No sooner do you think you have it eliminated than it jumps up again all over again. It can adopt to almost any culture, the political left or the political right, the rich or the poor, the educated or the uneducated, Catholics, Protestants, Shiites, Sunnis, in short, almost everywhere you look. I wish I had a simple explanation that covered anti-Semitism in all its forms and that told us how a people who constitute 0.2, not 2, 0.2 of the world's population could possibly elicit so much hatred. The fact is, I don't have one, and I don't know of anyone else who does. Anti-Semitism is not a simple phenomenon, nor is there a simple explanation for how 6 million Jews were killed for no other reason than the fact that they were Jewish. Here, let me say, I have written on the Holocaust. I have attended conferences on it. I've seen movies about it. But I have to tell you, whenever I think about it, the enormity and the horror of the event leaves me absolutely speechless. It still does. What I want to do tonight, though, is focus on one aspect of Judaism that as a philosopher I'm most familiar with. So we could retitle my lecture, "The Jew as Perennial Outsider." We can think of outsider in either of two ways. Geographically, someone who travels to a strange land and espouses views that the inhabitants may not be familiar with, or thematically, someone who dissents from prevailing opinions in his or her own culture. The problem is that outsiders typically cause trouble for those on the inside, and that's what I'm going to try to argue tonight. The prime example of a geographic outsider is, of course, Abraham, the first Jew. The story begins when God asks Abraham to leave the home of his father and travel to a new land. Unlike Odysseus, if we compare Abraham to it, Odysseus went home. Odysseus went home to his family in Ithaca. Abraham is asked to do something very different, not to go home, but to go to a place that he's never seen before, where he will be an outsider, not only ethnically, but intellectually. So following a well-known series of legends, I've constructed a dialogue. And this is my imagined dialogue between Abraham and the local residents of Canaan. Okay, Abraham, I come in peace, but at the direction of a God who may be new to you. Local residents, we're very happy to accept you and your God. We already have 12 gods of our own, and adding one more won't make much of a difference. Abraham, that's very kind of you, but unfortunately, you see, there's a problem. If you accept my God, you have to give up all of yours. Local residents, you're joking. Why should we give up our gods just to please your God? Abraham, because my God insists on exclusivity. Local residents, so then your God is not a team player. What's so special about your God? Can you at least show us a picture of your God? Abraham, sorry, no, I can't do that. You see, my God's glory cannot be captured in a visual medium. Local residents, then what does your God resemble? What sort of thing in the heavens above or the earth below or the waters in the earth is your God like? Abraham, I'm sorry, I can't help you there either. Local residents, all right, let's see if we get this straight. You're asking us to give up the gods we have worshiped for generations and to turn instead to a God we cannot see and whose glory cannot be captured in a material image. Abraham, now you've got it, good. Local residents, sorry, Abe, but you must be out of your mind. Not only does your conception of God make no sense, but we heard it from reliable sources that your God won't let us eat pork chops either. Okay, that's how Jewish history began, with a prophet in a strange land espousing a controversial doctrine. I'm going to argue that that's the key to understanding Jewish history and the animosity that has risen up against it. Open up to any page you want and you'll find people, Jews, who refuse to go along with the crowd. The story continues with Moses. He was a criminal living in exile among the Midianites when God first spoke to him. Although he became the greatest prophet the Jewish people have ever produced, it's noteworthy that he never set foot in the promised land. He went before Pharaoh as an outsider, just as Joseph went before Pharaoh as an outsider, and Esther went before Ahasuerus as an outsider. In addition to geographic outsiders, Abraham and Moses share another feature, and that is this. This is sometimes hard for people to accept. They don't always take what God says for granted. They're perfectly willing to dissent from God. When God proposes to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham objects that doing so would destroy the righteous along with the innocent. Shall not the judge of all earth do what is just? He asks of God. Faced with this challenge, God relents in the face of human protest. Later in the book of Exodus, the Israelite nation begins to worship the golden calf. God gets so angry with it that he threatens to destroy it and start all over again. But like Abraham before him, Moses protests. A midrash has it that Moses held on to God's cloak and would not let go until God had relented again. The truth is that human confrontations, or if you will, dissent from God, are a familiar theme in the Hebrew Bible. Let's take Jacob. After Jacob wrestles with the angel at the river Jabbok, his name is changed to Israel, which, at least according to biblical etymology, means he has struggled with beings both divine and human. I repeat, Israel is taken to mean he has struggled with beings both divine and human. So you could say even our name implies some form of challenge or conflict. Moving beyond the further in the biblical period, let me take up the case of another outsider of heroic proportions. And here I refer to Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite woman who married an Israelite man. But her husband died during a famine, leaving her a widow with no means of support. She was forced to glean to stay alive. When Naomi, an Israelite, urges Ruth to return to Moab, Ruth refuses and throws her lot in with the Israelite people and the Israelite God. Eventually, Boaz, a wealthy Israelite from Bethlehem, sees Ruth gleaning in his field, and after a brief encounter, takes her as his bride. Now, my reason for mentioning Ruth is to highlight the fact that it is from Ruth and Boaz that King David will descend. And according to tradition, it is from Ruth and Boaz that the Messiah will come eventually. Now, this is all quite astonishing if you think about it, given that Ruth was a poor Moabite woman living on the margins of a male-dominated society. She was, in short, a consummate outsider. Now, up to now, I've mainly dealt with geographic outsiders, so let's now turn to people who are outsiders thematically, which is to say Jews who stood apart from the crowd even in their own country. And here I refer to the great literary prophets. The first one, in fact, my personal favorite is the prophet Amos. If you know the story of Amos, he walked up to the high priest at Shiloh on the holiest day of the year and said right to the face of the high priest that the religion he was practicing was a sham, because the people were neglecting the poor, they were cheating people in the marketplace and selling their neighbors into slavery for trivial sums of money. So you can imagine the high priest says, "Who the heck are you?" Amos identifies himself as a sheep herder and a dresser of sycamore trees. So you want to imagine this. The high priest is in fine linen with a turban and jewelry and so on. And Amos, I picture him in work clothes with rough hands. But it's Amos who says that he, rather than the high priest, speaks for God. Next in this line is Hosea. He married a common prostitute whose unfaithfulness to him he thought symbolized Israel's unfaithfulness to God. His indictment of his fellow Jews is scathing. He accuses them of virtually every crime imaginable, as he says, crime upon crime. The prophet Isaiah agreed with Amos that the religion that the people were practicing was a sham. And he told them, Isaiah did, not only does God not want your hymns and your sacrifices and your festivals, but guess what? God despises them. Strong words. Jeremiah said that the priests and the prophets of Jerusalem were completely corrupt and that their wickedness extended even into the holy temple. Ezekiel said, you know what? When you look at Jerusalem, quite frankly, Sodom and Gomorrah don't seem that bad anymore. So now let's be clear. These people were thoroughly disgusted by the behavior of their fellow Jews, so much so that Amos said that only 10% of them would be worth saving on Judgment Day. But what's amazing to me is first that their voices were preserved. I mean, most cultures would have gotten rid of this literature right away. It's damning. Well, not only were their voices preserved, but according to Jewish tradition, their writings are sacred. As far as Jewish tradition is concerned, Amos was right. These are the people who spoke for God, not the high priest. So once again, dissent is not just tolerated here, but in this case, as in others, it arises to his heroic proportions. Nowhere is this clear. Consider God's call to Jeremiah. God calls Jeremiah. Jeremiah is only a teenager, and God tells him that the kings and priests and prophets of Judea are all corrupt, and that he, Jeremiah, must make war against them. Needless to say, we know the fight is not going to be easy. In fact, Jeremiah was beaten. He was put in the stocks overnight. He was jailed. He was thrown into a pit without food and water and left to die. So he's a prime example of what I would call a divinely ordained whistleblower who called on society to change its ways or face impending disaster. All right, leave the biblical period and turn to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. I realize that his name may not be familiar to all of you, but I assure you he's an interesting character. He lived in the first Judean revolt against Rome. And during the siege of Jerusalem, he angered many of his fellow Jews by arguing for peace instead of war. According to legend, this is where it gets really interesting. According to legend, he faked his own death. They had a fake funeral, and he had his students carry him out of Jerusalem in a casket. Once he got outside of the walls of Jerusalem, he made a separate peace with the Roman general Vespasian and predicted that Vespasian would soon become emperor. Well, his deal was that he said to Vespasian, you can rule Judea. It's yours. You can rule it. Just let me open a rabbinic academy in Yavna. Well, we know that Vespasian did become emperor soon thereafter, and we know that a rabbinic academy was founded in Yavna. But let's again be clear, it wasn't the Romans that Yohanan was afraid of. Why he had to be carried out of Jerusalem in a casket. What he was afraid of was the zealots among his own people. He was a dissenter. He was afraid that if they knew what he was going to do, which is to make a separate peace, they would have killed him immediately. Okay. That brings me to my favorite group of people, the Jewish philosophers. I'm not going to cover all of them, so you can relax. Let's have the first slide. There he is, Moses Maimonides, aka the Rambam or the Great Eagle. He too was unhappy with his fellow Jews, not so much because of their behavior as much as with their beliefs. He thought that Moses and the patriarchs had discovered monotheism in ancient times, but since then the Jewish people had forgotten it and were now wallowing in a sea of ignorance and illusion. And therefore he took it upon himself to return the Jewish people to their true calling. All right, how do you do that? How do you return the Jewish people to their true calling? Well, in his opinion, it meant convincing the people that the overriding purpose of their religion, what is behind every ritual, every prayer, every festival, what is behind everything we are asked to do is the improvement of the mind. And the improvement of the mind, in his opinion, meant the never-ending search for truth. Since the primary truth of Judaism is belief in a God who has no material form, he argued, we have to engage in a massive reinterpretation of our sacred literature to remove any suggestion that God can be described in human terms. As we know, the Torah often describes God in human terms. He thought any passage, for example, that says God spoke, that God descended on the mountaintop, that God became angry, had to be seriously rethought. To interpret these passages literally, which would be to give human form to God, as many people did in his day and still do in ours, he thought was no better than bowing to a statue of Zeus or Athena. In a word, he thought it amounted to idolatry. So Maimonides set off a controversy that's still with us. Why should we trust a philosopher of all people, let alone one who was inspired by a pagan like Aristotle to tell us how to read our own sacred literature? To many people, it seemed that Maimonides was putting more trust in Aristotle than in Moses. We know, for example, that a group of rabbis in southern France burned his books in the town square. As I often tell my students, it isn't just Nazis who burn books. Even today, the years that I've taught Maimonides, I hear students with excellent backgrounds in Jewish studies complain, how can he say this? Where is he getting this from? The answer, his answer, is that if you care about the truth, you have to be willing to abandon many things you once took for granted. If it happens that somebody outside the tradition speaks the truth, he thought Aristotle, then in his opinion, you have to interpret the Torah in accordance with their view, no matter how strange that may seem. And we can see this in his opinion of astrology. Astrology was wildly popular in the Middle Ages. There are even passages in the Talmud that suggest that human behavior is influenced by the position of the planets at the time of a person's birth, Maimonides didn't care. He wrote a letter to rabbinic authorities arguing there was no scientific basis for astrology and that it amounted to garbage. In fact, he went even further, saying that many of the problems that the Jewish people faced can be linked to their willingness to accept astrology rather than legitimate science. Next slide. After Maimonides, we have Baruch Spinoza. He was the son of parents who were forced to leave Portugal because they were caught practicing Judaism in secret. They settled in Amsterdam. Spinoza had the chutzpah to argue that neither civil nor religious authorities have the right to control what people think or to tell them what they can say. Now, the prevailing argument of the time was that free speech and freedom of religion would weaken the social fabric and therefore should be prohibited. Spinoza countered that so far from weakening the social fabric, these freedoms actually strengthen it. Simply put, his opinion, open societies are more stable than closed ones. And I know that this may not strike us as all that radical, but let's forget that Spinoza advanced these ideas more than 100 years before people gathered to draft the US Constitution, at a time in the 17th century when religious warfare and religious persecution, unfortunately, were still quite common. In addition to defending free speech, he claimed that we should never use the Bible to impede scientific progress. The Bible, he thought, is concerned with behavior, not with physics and astronomy. After the scientific revolution, he thought only a fool would use an ancient text like the Bible to tell them about the structure of the world. Again, my guess is most of us take this for granted. Nobody expects a student in an astronomy class today to raise their hand and say, "Hey, professor, but the Bible says this." I can only tell you, though, that Spinoza's audience, when it read this, it voiced its disapproval immediately. The book in which these ideas were advanced was said to be forged in hell by the devil himself. And for all of you academics out there, how would you like to get a review that says your book was forged in hell by the devil himself? We know that even among his own people, the rabbinic court of Amsterdam put Spinoza in cherem, which is the Jewish equivalent of excommunication. He was excluded from the Jewish community. Though it should be said that the early Zionists loved Spinoza. They thought he was right on. David Ben-Gurion even offered to go before the rabbinic court of Amsterdam and plead Spinoza's case to get him reinstated. But unfortunately, it never worked. Next slide. Following Spinoza, we have Moses Mendelssohn, the father of the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, as well as an active participant in the Aufklärung, or German Enlightenment. He was a contemporary and associate of Immanuel Kant. Though Kant was surely the better philosopher, as anyone who's tried to read Kant will attest, Mendelssohn was far and away the better writer. As one of the leading intellectuals of his day, Mendelssohn was asked why he still adhered to an antiquated religion like Judaism. And in his answer, he put to rest one of the classic arguments used by anti-Semites then as now. That argument is that Jews are concerned only with the welfare of other Jews. Therefore, it was argued it's folly to expect a Jew to act on behalf of the welfare of Germans, Frenchmen, Italians, or Americans. If this is true, by the way, it would be impossible to be a Jew and an American at the same time. Of course, this argument completely ignores all the Jews who did sacrifice their lives for their home countries. I might add, including Germany, even Germany in World War I. In any event, to his fellow Jews, Mendelssohn argued that they could remain true to the tradition of their ancestors and still be loyal members of a secular state. In fact, he was so anxious to get Jews to become full-fledged members of Germany that he tried to get them to abandon Yiddish and speak proper German instead. To Germans, he argued that they had nothing to fear from Jews, because there was nothing in Jewish tradition that prevented them from being model citizens. Needless to say, his arguments often fell on deaf ears. Let us not forget that despite his leading position in German life and letters, he himself did not enjoy the rights of a citizen because he was Jewish. Next slide. Moving from philosophic leadership to political leadership, we get to Theodor Herzl. He advocated Zionism at a time when many of the leading Jewish figures, especially in the Orthodox community, were vehemently opposed to it. Their argument was that you could not have a refounding of a Jewish state unless and until God sent the Messiah, but it could not be done by human effort alone. So originally, the first Zionist Congress was supposed to be in Munich. As it turned out, there was so much opposition to it among the German rabbinate that it had to be moved to Basel instead. Even then, few leading people among the intellectuals or the rabbinate attended it. We have another example of a man or a person who stuck his neck out and was, in his own age, a dissenter. This is in some ways a good example of how an idea that we may take for granted once had to be fought for. Next slide. Here we have on the left Herman Cohen, on the right Martin Buber. I have them here because they got into a famous debate on the nature of Zionism. In one sense, the picture's a little misleading because Cohen was a generation older than Buber. This is the only picture I could find with both of them, but this makes Buber look older than Cohen. It was really the other way around. In any event, Cohen was the first Jew to be appointed a professor of philosophy in Germany. That's to say, someone who didn't convert to Christianity in order to get his position. He was the leading Kant scholar of his generation. Even then, there was opposition to him both inside and outside the Jewish community. The outside opposition was the familiar argument. As a Jew, he had no right to be teaching Kant. Cohen wasn't really German. The outside opposition to Cohen concerned the question of whether Jewish cultural renewal was best achieved in a Jewish homeland or a modern secular state. Cohen argued for a modern secular state. He opposed Zionism. Buber argued for a Jewish homeland. Needless to say, both models exist today. We have thriving Jewish communities, both in modern secular states and in the state of Israel. For the most part, the debate over Zionism ended in 1948, but I do want to stress that for a while there was a serious debate. It's worth noting, however, that Buber, who was one of the original proponents of Zionism, did not always agree with the direction the new state was taking, and you guessed it, became something of a dissenter. Okay, next slide. Albert Einstein. Einstein advocated Zionism, but rejected the traditional Jewish conception of God. You'd have to go all the way back to Copernicus to find a scientist whose ideas constituted so radical an assault on our common sense view of the world. But look, it's often forgotten, Einstein did not, I repeat, did not win the Nobel Prize for the theory of relativity. In fact, he was told point blank he could not even mention relativity in his acceptance speech. It's also often overlooked that distinguished members of the German scientific community, including 2 Nobel Prize laureates, rejected the theory of relativity, proclaiming it Jewish physics. Think about that for a minute. Jewish physics. Hard though it may be to believe, Einstein declined to speak on relativity at a meeting of the Society for German Scientists and Physicians in 1922 because he feared for his life. There were death threats. This was a Jew rejecting classical physics. And that was 10 years before Hitler even came to power. Once Hitler did come to power, a popular magazine in Germany put a bounty on Einstein's head. Next slide. Let's move from science back to politics. Here we have Emma, AKA Red Emma Goldman, once described as the most dangerous woman in America. She was born in Lithuania and emigrated to the United States in 1885. She was a committed anarchist, a fierce opponent of capitalism, militarism, the criminal justice system, sexism, and homophobia. She was a powerful orator. She spoke fluent Yiddish and often attracted large audiences of Jewish immigrants. Not surprisingly, she was arrested and jailed numerous times, including convictions for disseminating birth control literature, which was considered obscene at the time, and for opposing military conscription during World War I. In 1919, she was declared a subversive and deported to the Soviet Union. Although she originally supported the Russian Revolution, she soon became disillusioned with Lenin and spoke out against all forms of totalitarianism. Not surprisingly, this earned her critics both on the political left and on the political right. By the way, she's buried out here in Forest Park, if you want to see her grave, alongside people who were executed for their involvement in the Haymarket riot. Next slide. Let's turn to the other side of the political spectrum. Here is Leo Strauss. Left Germany in 1932, and after teaching at various institutions in America, he became a professor of political science at the University of Chicago in 1949. Strauss challenged many of the assumptions that were common among the academics of his day. In fact, they're still quite common. He questioned liberal political theory on the grounds that its commitment to toleration rendered it incapable of defending the very values to which it said it was committed. Instead, he thought, liberal political theory typically leads to relativism and eventually to nihilism, either in the form of a tyrannical government like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, or in the form of a permissive society like our own that succumbs to hedonism. Strauss also challenged the claim of Enlightenment thinkers that society could be founded on reason alone without any reference to divine revelation. As he saw it, Western civilization thrived on the tension between reason and revelation, rather than one or the other by itself. He remains to this day a controversial. He has a devoted following, people who still inspire passionate disputes, some of which I myself are involved in. Now, I could go on. We don't have all night. I understand that. I could go on. Louis Brandeis, the AKA the Robin Hood lawyer. Abraham Joshua Heschel, the theologian, who walked alongside Martin Luther King in Selma, Alabama, and said at the time he thought he was praying with his feet. And finally, Ruth Bader Ginsburg needs no introduction. I'm well aware that other cultures have produced dissenters. There's Socrates, Joan of Arc, Galileo, Emile Zola, Charles Darwin, Marie Curie, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King. But I don't know of any other culture where dissent became so deeply ingrained, even to the point where the founders of that culture took it upon themselves to dissent from God. Dissent, as Heschel once said, is indigenous to Judaism. We've seen it was there at the start with Abraham. It has continued through the ages with a long line of naysayers, whistleblowers, and controversial figures. Again, we saw that it is even implied by our very name, Israel. You could say that it is almost in our DNA. So let's face it, dissent is not conducive to popularity. On the contrary, most people prefer unanimity. There's great comfort in being part of a crowd and knowing that thousands and millions of people share your opinion. But look, if herd immunity is a good thing, I put it to you, the herd mentality is not. The inevitable result of a herd mentality is binary thinking. You're either an insider or an outsider. Next comes the demonization of the outsider as someone who threatens the livelihood of the group. And this has happened to practically all the people we've talked about. From demonization, it's a small step to the epithets that are typically leveled at Jews: Christ killers, infidels, the apotheosis of international communism, the apotheosis of cutthroat capitalism. Too crude, too suave, too parochial, too cosmopolitan. Nobody ever said that prejudice has to be logically consistent. People who need a scapegoat will fix on practically anything to justify their hatred. And that raises an interesting question. If you need a scapegoat to defend your position, is your position really worth defending at all? All right, let's try to sum up. With this background in mind, what are we supposed to do? On the one hand, dissent is indigenous to our tradition. On the other hand, it's a feature of our tradition that has made us scapegoats from ancient times all the way up through the present day. To me, the answer is clear. If generations of Jews have run the risk of not going along with the crowd, it is incumbent on us to do the same. We must continue to call out injustice when we see it. We must continue to speak truth to power. We must continue to be willing to take unpopular stands on issues of the day. Without dissent, we get complacency. And with complacency, what I would call spiritual and intellectual paralysis. The paralysis may not kill anyone, but it poses as much a threat to Jewish survival as the KKK, the BDS, or anyone else. More than a formidable army or an impenetrable fortress, I believe that what has kept Judaism alive over the ages is its willingness to hear, even to canonize, dissenting voices. So yes, it's hard to be a Jew, but supremely worth it in the end. Thank you.
Ken, thank you so much. This is the point in the evening typically where we would hear, roaring applause from our participants, who I'm sure are applauding in the comfort of their own homes. And I know I speak for everyone when I say that that this was an inspiring and stirring lecture, and a very, very clear articulation of why Professor Siskin has been such a popular and sought after teacher and mentor for so many generations of Northwestern students. And I know that I'm speaking for everyone, in fact, because lots of comments are coming in the Q&A. Thank you, what a wonderful teacher, what a wonderful professor, etc. We have gotten some questions that are actually questions though, and not only thank yous and praises. And let me just remind anybody who has not yet submitted a question that now is your opportunity. Please go to the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and feel free to put in a question. I'm going to be collating and curating these questions and presenting them to Ken, but the more I have to work with, the happier I will be. Although I do have lots of questions of my own. I'll see if we get to any of those. I'm going to start, Ken, with a question, and I'll give you, in this case, I'll give you the person who posed the question. It's my colleague and your colleague, Professor Joel Mokyr, who says that of all the dissenters, of all the Jewish dissenters, you failed to mention maybe the most heterodox and influential of them all, Karl Marx. Do you think it was accidental that he had Jewish roots?
He did have Jewish roots, and he certainly did not live as a Jew. My mentor, the late Professor Stephen Schwarzschild, always considered Marx a prototypical Jew. I do not. When he wrote on the Jewish problem, he was one of the ones who said that the Jew represented the apotheosis of cutthroat capitalism. He criticized the Sabbath observance being laziness, the Jew doesn't want to go to work. He had Jewish ancestors, I agree. I do not consider, I thought about including him and I decided it would be a bad idea. I did include Emma, if you want somebody from the radical left. Let's leave, I would leave Karl Marx out of this. I just don't think he belongs there.
Okay, thank you. A fair response. I hope, Professor Mokyr, that you agree. Let me now pose a question. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, but a question came in from Larry having to do with the argument that you made about Jews as a sort of perpetual band of outsiders who celebrate and even canonize disagreement. And I guess he asked this as a question, but anticipated your conclusion, I think, that this actually serves as not just a source of anti-Semitism, but as a source of Jewish longevity and Jewish sort of identity and community. So I wonder if you'd agree with that characterization. And if so, I wonder what you would make of the fact, or how we can account for the fact that so many of the groups that are being dissented from in your case studies are the Jewish community itself. What does that tell us about sort of the nature of Jewish dissent vis-a-vis Jewish community?
Well, I agree. It is one of the things I think that keeps us vibrant, that keeps us intellectually active. Once you stifle dissent, you ossify. You go to sleep on a comfortable bed of dogma that's never questioned again. Fortunately, I think that isn't the way our history runs. Now, we pay a heavy price for this kind of dissent. We haven't always had unity. We don't have it now. We haven't had it through the ages. Look at Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Talmud is full of dissenting opinions, for example. So I take this as a strength, not a weakness. My great worry is that we would give it up and sort of take an inward looking position of let's stick with our own and just keep asserting the same ideas all over again. That's spiritual death. So yes, whoever asked this question, I think understood me perfectly. This is vibrancy. This is the intellectual, and I think the religious and spiritual makeup, at least I hope, of this people.
Terrific, thank you. The next question that I'm going to pose is was submitted by Linda, who wants to know if it's possible that the tradition of dissent that you described stems in part from a sense that we are God's partners in managing the world. I wonder what you would make of the connection between the dissent piece and then the sort of partnership with the divine.
We have a berit or a covenant or a partnership with God. I would only point out, though, that we have always taken that partnership as going both ways. That is to say, we don't, as with Abraham, we don't always agree with what God says. There's a famous passage in the Talmud, for example, where the rabbis ruled God out of court. God enters a legal dispute, and the rabbis say, sorry, you have no standing in this court. We'll decide this on our own by the vote of a majority. So yes, we are partnerships. We have a partnership, but that should not be taken, should never be taken as blind obedience. Blind obedience is a very different sort of thing. I would say blind obedience is not a partnership. Blind obedience is a one-way relationship. You have the commander and the commanded. Fortunately, I think it's always been much more complicated, that our relationship with God goes back and forth. In Buberian terms, if I can use that, is a kind of a dialogue. That's a partnership. Yes, partnership with everything that implies. True partnership.
So I'm going to give you another compound question now, which has to do with something that Dean Randolph mentioned in his introduction, which is your longstanding interest and your publications on Messianism. And the questioner is wondering what to do about this notion that dissent is intrinsic and is built into Judaism, or at least has been, and that it serves as this source of change and vibrancy that you're describing. Where on the other hand, we sometimes think about the sort of telos, right, the end goal of Judaism in the Messianic era, as being maybe the dissolution of difference, or certainly unity and harmony. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. The last chapter of my book on Messianism. I didn't interpret a Messianic age as meaning the end of discussion, the end of disagreement. From now, we've got everything straight and clear, and we can all pat ourselves on our back and go home. That's not what I think Messianism is all about. Well, here I am very partial to Maimonides, who said that this is not, Messianism is not going to solve all of our problems. What it will do is bring peace. It will bring the end of war so that we can devote ourselves to more important things than trying to kill each other. And therefore, we will have more time to study, more time to read the Torah. But as he would have been the first to admit, not all of our questions are ever going to be answered. There are limits to human knowledge. Science progresses. It will progress, I hope, in the Messianic age as well as in our own. We'll just, for Maimonides, we'll have more time to do science. That will lead to questions. It'll lead to disagreements. It'll lead to theories that come in and out of popularity. So it will open up the life of the mind in a way that perhaps we don't have it now. But I wouldn't understand the Messianic age as everyone bobbing, nodding their heads to the same proposition. Again, I think that's, to me, that's paralysis. That's the end, not the telos, as you put it.
So I'm going to pose now another compound question. This comes from another colleague, Professor Richard Kiekeffer, and it looks like an old fraternity brother of yours, Myron Glassenberg. So I'm going to fuse these two together, two people maybe you've known at different stages.
I left out, I dropped my fraternity after about 4 weeks.
Okay. Well, in that case, now's your chance to get back to it. I'm sure that in the fraternity, they spend most of their time discussing philosophy. Professor Kiekhaefer has cited, has given a quote here from Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, the well-known Talmud scholar and Israeli rabbi. He says, the Talmud is perhaps the only sacred book in all of world culture that permits and even encourages the student to question it. So Richard wanted to know if this is another way of saying that Rabbinic Judaism is founded on dissent. And then I want to juxtapose that question with a number of others that have come up about groups that see themselves today as heirs, or maybe the only heirs of Rabbinic Judaism. People have noted various ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jewish communities for whom dissent is not of value. I guess, what would you make of that juxtaposition?
Well, let's start with the Talmud. Yes, students are encouraged to dissent and to ask questions. There's a famous passage where, as I recall, a debate between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And God comes down and says, both of these opinions are sacred. Eventually, the school of Hillel wins. But God says, both of these positions here are sacred, which I take to mean that even the minority in this debate is saying something that we can learn from, saying something of value, saying something we do not want to suppress. To me, that is the spirit of Rabbinic Judaism. There are disagreements that go on over the ages. There aren't just people of one age talking to each other, that are carried on over generations. Now, this is off-putting to some people. I know that. That's why, in many ways, the Talmud is a very difficult book to read, and I'm far from an authority on it. But it's loaded with dissent. And I think that it speaks well for it. There are communities where dissent is stifled. Sure. All I can say is it's not my view of Judaism, and I think I have enough precedents, both biblical, philosophical, and contemporary, to back up what I'm saying. They have a right to their position, of course, but it's not my view of how the tradition began, what sustained it, and where I hope it's going.
So there are still questions pouring in, which I take to mean that people would like for this Q&A to continue at least for a few more minutes, if that's all right.
We could make this, why don't we keep this going till Shavuos? We're supposed to stay up all night on Shavuos and study and talk to each other. We'll just continue this into the month of May. How about that? So
we're on the cusp of Lag BaOmer for those who are following the Jewish calendar. Only 17 days to go. Ken, I think, has just agreed to stay on in some sort of a marathon. So let's play it by ear. I want to pose a historical question to you, which is that a cynical person listening to your lecture might conclude that the best way to be rid of the scourge of anti-Semitism is for Jews to just finally stop dissenting from things and try to, whether we use the word assimilate or go along with the mainstream culture. And yet, we know, and you certainly know better than most, that over the course of the time that Cohen and Buber and other scholars, Mendelssohn certainly, were writing, there were large contingents of Jews who wanted nothing more than to become just regular Germans. And we know that that was not the solution to the problem of anti-Semitism. So what do you make of the historical circumstances in which these philosophers were writing?
Yeah, as I said, there is no one simple explanation. And you are quite right. Conversion, well, let's go back to the Spanish Inquisition. We know in the Spanish, you probably know better than I do, it's your specialty, the Middle Ages, but conversion to Christianity did not always save your life. In certain cases, the fact that you had Jewish blood counted, and no matter, you could have kissed the cross 100 times and it wouldn't have saved you. Ditto for Nazi Germany. If you had one Jewish grandparent, no matter how many times you protested that you were German and that you didn't want to be, it didn't save you. So yes, point well taken. there is this kind of virulent brand of anti-Semitism that is always, that sees it not so much culturally in terms of the Jewish tendency to dissent, but sees it biologically. Very, very dangerous. It's always been. It's always been. It may not. Let's hope it does. I can't predict whether it will or it won't. But you're quite right. On a historical basis, there were people who abandoned Judaism, but it didn't always help them.
So I'm going to pose, I think, 2 more questions to you with your permission. The first is another figure that one of our questioners would like to hear more about in the context of your argument, and that's Freud. So Marx, early in the Q&A, was sort of sidelined in this conversation. What do you make of Freud and somebody who whose Jewish roots might have informed his dissent?
I thought long and hard about Freud, and the only reason it was really a time constraint. I think he belongs, and certainly his Judaism, not that he was an observant Jew, but his being a Jew with a controversial view of human behavior got him all kinds of criticism. It was just a question of time. I included Einstein. I could, if you had given me 15 more minutes, I would have included Freud. I probably would have said more about Brandeis. Surely there are others who could have and should have been included, not Marx. I don't want to put Marx in there.
So we'll have to wait for the sequel of this lecture to hear about who else could fit in. So here's the last question, and I'm asking it to you slightly tongue-in-cheek, although it was posed, and I think it's an interesting question. And I'll preface it by saying that some of our questions are asking you not for your philosophical or historical knowledge, but for your predictive powers about where Judaism in America, Judaism in the world is heading. And one of our questioners asked, do you think a Jew can ever become president of the United States? And I take that to mean, given Jews' outsider history as an outsider group, and given the dissenting voice that you've pointed to, what are the limits on Jewish integration in the world that we live in today?
Well, first of all, the Talmud says that at the destruction of the Second Temple, the job of predicting the future was given over to children and fools. So I prefaced my comments with that. We almost had a Jewish vice president, Lieberman. I mean, that, so I mean, it's, is it possible? Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible. My parents wouldn't have liked it. My in-laws wouldn't have liked it. They were always afraid that if there were a Jewish president and anything went wrong in the country, they would blame everything on the Jews. Would I like to see it? Yeah, and I don't, sure, it could happen. I'm not making a political prediction. I would hope that American society has gotten to the point where this kind of restriction no longer applies. Let me just say that it used to be that Catholics could not run for high office because it was thought that they owed greater allegiance to the Pope than to the United States of America. We had John F. Kennedy. We now have Joe Biden. So if that barrier was broken, the barrier of gender may be broken soon. Let's hope that the religious barrier is broken.
On that hopeful and optimistic note, let me thank you again one more time, Ken, for really a wonderful lecture. We were all really lucky to be in the opportunity, even in this Zoom era, to study together with you.
Say one more thing. If your question wasn't, you didn't have time to get to your question, you can email me, k-seeskin@northwestern.edu. If you can't remember that, go to the philosophy department website, the Jewish Studies website. I'm listed as an emeritus professor. Email me your question. I will do my very best to get back to you with an answer.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you again to our friends and partners at the JUF. Thank you again, Dean Randolph, for your stirring introduction. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.